How is it that you came to worship? Not just tonight, not just how you happened upon our church and walked into the doors and decided you were going to come into God's house. But I want you to think about how it was that you became a person who worships God, who comes into a sanctuary week in, week out, maybe day in, day out, hopefully more than year in, year out. But what was it that brought you into the fold? I think back to when I was a child, and I was a child who spent many, many hours in church. And I've shared this story lots of times before, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that my grandmother was the church secretary, and I got in a lot of trouble at home. And I'm sure you can all picture that. But I was always in so much trouble at home that my mother she would be fed up with me. And so she would send me to church to be with my grandmother. And I would spend a lot of time just in the sanctuary, looking around, kind of peeking behind things that I shouldn't be behind. Like going to the organ and looking at all the pedals and finding the organist's shoes that he would wear when he played. Just peeking in all the nooks and all the crannies and finding the secret passageways and all of the neat places in the church. And I really felt like the church was my home. Because it truly was sanctuary. But Sunday morning, I didn't really get into the worship experience, because I was the kind of kid who would sit in the balcony of the church, like we have here, but I would sit in the balcony, and there would be a certain point of the service when I would slip out the back door, and I would kind of play the Mission Impossible theme in my head and sneak around the church and try to find candy that was hidden in different places. And if I was really, really bad, I might even take a key. Now I sound like a thief. But I might even take a key and unlock a door where I knew there was candy. And then I'd get back and go back up to the balcony before the end of the service and wonder if anybody ever noticed that I'd slipped out. So that was kind of my worship experience. But I remember having this day when I realized that I was coloring in my bulletin and thinking about how I wished I had $1 million because I was going to build a special little booth for me to sit in the corner of the sanctuary with a hot tub. And I would just sit there while church was going on so I could be in church. And then I had this moment of conviction, and that's all I can call it as a kid. It was conviction, because I realized, Melissa, why do you think you come to church? Why are you here? Why do you sit here just coloring in your little book? Why are you so wrapped up in what you want to do later and what you think is going on? Don't you understand what we're doing here? You are in God's house. You are in the sanctuary, and God is here. And you're with people who need to feel God, who need to know the presence of the Lord. Who cares about your candy you're trying to steal, you little thief? That's a sin anyway. You are here to worship and here to praise. You are here to know that Jesus is Lord. I had that moment. And I realized that I had to be there. I had to come into the house of God. Not because it was expected of me, not because anybody dragged me there, but because truly to come into the house of God and to bring worship is the only response we can truly have for anything when we think about the ways that God has blessed us in our lives and how God works in everything that we experience, how God holds us in our moments of pain, how God gives us what we need at the moment when we need it, how God brings hope when we don't have any hope. Every bit of that should make us leap for joy and thanksgiving, and also bring us to our knees and say, have mercy on me, God, because so much of my time is spent not even considering what you have done. When I look at the scriptures, I love to see examples of worship that we find when we're going through the books of the Bible. And that's why I stumbled upon this piece in 1 Chronicles, because that's one of those history books that gets kind of boring to read. You're reading through 1 Chronicles and you're reading all of these battles and all these events that happen, and you forget some of the names and it's hard to wrap your head around it. But there's this point in the scripture, and you think about it, it's in the midst of what all of Israel faces by being attacked on all different sides and experiencing times where they feel God's absence, but even times when they feel mightily God's presence with them. And it brings them to the point here where they sing to the Lord, all the earth. Share the news of his saving work every single day. Declare God's glory among the nations. Declare his wondrous works among all people. That's a call for how we're supposed to interact with God and the whole world on behalf of God. That we're supposed to take what God has done out into the world and share that. But I want you to look here at verse 29. Because it tells us what we're doing when we respond to God, when we come to worship. It says we're to bring gifts, enter his presence, bow down to the Lord in his holy splendor, tremble before him, all the earth. It tells us he set the world firmly in place, but it won't be shaken. That's a prescription right there for how it is we worship God. We come into the sanctuary, we bring the gifts that we have. First, the gift of ourself, the gifts of our time and our talents and our treasure. But we come bringing these gifts and bowing before God, because of what God has done for us. And we tremble before him. I think about how we're invited to come into worship. And this whole month we're going to be talking about response. Ways that we respond to what God has done in our lives. But when we think about worship, so often it becomes this thing that we discard if it's not convenient. Anybody with me on that? I want you to think about it. I had a conversation with somebody just this past week about worship attendance and who comes to church. And what he was sharing with me was in his particular congregation, they'd done a survey, and I want you to guess, what is the average number of times that somebody worships in a given month? The average worship attendance for a person? How often do they come to church? A faithful attender.
Preaching to the choir because they're here on Thursday.
Well, yeah, you're here. But think about it. 1.3 times a month is faithful worship attendance. The early church worshiped every single day. Sometimes multiple times a day. Before work, noontime, after dinner, they would come together, they would sit around the table, they'd sing hymns, they'd sing praises to God, they would worship with everything that they were. They would tremble before God. They would bring everything that they had. But the problem is, we're comfortable people. We have places we can go. We have fun things we can do. We have all sorts of agendas. We can sneak out and find candy all over the church. That's why we give it to the kids during the children's sermon. They don't have to sneak out and hide and find it. But worship becomes something that people come to from time to time. Not you all, of course, because like Pastor John said, you're here Thursday night. I'm preaching to the choir. But I want you to think about how important it is to worship. Not just when we come into the sanctuary even, but in your homes every day. To take time to sing praise to God, to take time to kneel before God in prayer, to take time to bear witness to everything